Hi, everyone. This is Global Podcast, your window to the world. Breaking news, big ideas, your global hangout for what's happening now, and bold conversations. Wherever you are, we're bringing it to you. Let's get started.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here. Looks like you brought a whole bunch of information on how the world reacted to President Trump's new tariffs.
Yeah, it's been quite the quite the response.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're trying to do today is figure out what it all means. Like what these reactions tell us about trade and what's important for people to pay attention to. It looks like there's a whole bunch of different approaches out there. Some countries are hitting right back, others are being a little more careful.
Exactly, and that's what's so interesting about the material you provided. It really captures those first reactions and positions from some major players on the global stage. China, Canada, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Brazil, and Mexico. It's a snapshot of how a world, I guess, adjusts to these big shifts in trade policy.
So let's start with China. They seem to be taking a very direct approach. I mean, they announced a 34% tariff right back on us, on all U.S. imports, and that's effective April 10, 2025. But the thing that really stands out is the part about them potentially restricting exports of rare earth elements. So what are those exactly, and why should U.S. tech companies be worried about this?
Yeah, rare earth elements are super important. I mean, strategically important. So there's 17 of these metallic elements, and they're absolutely essential for making a whole bunch of advanced technologies, everything from smartphones and electric car batteries to military equipment. And the thing is, China controls most of the global supply. So if they decide to limit exports, well, that could create some serious supply chain problems.
Yeah, shortages.
Exactly, and potentially drive up costs for U.S. industries, too. So this isn't just about trade anymore. It's also a question of, national security. There's a real vulnerability there.
Wow, okay, so it's a pretty powerful countermove from them. And they're also adding, looks like, 16 U.S. entities to their export control list and another 11 U.S. firms to what they call their unreliable entities list. What exactly does that mean for those companies?
Well, being on that export control list means those U.S. entities are going to have a harder time getting certain things, items that could be used for civilian purposes, but also for military purposes. It's basically restricting access to dual-use technologies. As for the unreliable entities list, think of that as a blacklist, which could really limit those companies' ability to do business in China. It's a signal that China's willing to increase economic pressure.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about Canada, our neighbors to the north. They're imposing a 25% tariff on, specifically, U.S. vehicle imports that don't meet the terms of CUSMA, which is, of course, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Why focus on the auto sector?
Well, you got to remember that the auto industry in the U.S. and Canada, it's very integrated. There are supply chains that cross the border. And so targeting cars that don't meet those CUSMA rules seems like a way for them to protect their own domestic auto manufacturing while still, adhering to the trade agreement for vehicles that do meet those rules.
Yeah, that's interesting because they're exempting auto parts from these tariffs. So that seems kind of different from the way the U.S. has been approaching things. Why do you think they're prioritizing keeping those supply chains for parts open?
It seems like Canada is really trying to avoid any major disruptions to those auto supply chains, the ones that cross the border. By keeping parts flowing freely, they can probably safeguard the efficiency and the competitiveness of their own auto industry. And of course, they're still putting those tariffs on the finished vehicles that don't meet the trade agreement's requirements.
Okay, so the EU seems to be playing this a little differently. They're talking about what they call legal proportional countermeasures. And they're really emphasizing negotiation instead of immediate retaliation. Why that approach?
Well, the EU has always been really committed to the idea of a global trade system based on rules that everyone agrees to. So they prefer to resolve disputes through established channels like the World Trade Organization, the WTO. They really see these Trump tariffs as a threat to the stability of that whole system, a threat to global economic stability. So their emphasis on, talking things out and responding in a measured way suggests they want to cool things down while still, protecting their own interests within the legal framework.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, Japan and South Korea, they seem to have had very different reactions. Japan's expressing regret, and they're hoping to get exemptions. They're prioritizing the diplomatic route. South Korea, on the other hand, is putting emergency support measures in place, particularly for the automotive sector. Looks like they're emphasizing government intervention. What do these different strategies tell us?
Well, it shows that Japan and South Korea have different vulnerabilities and different priorities when it comes to their economies. Japan relies heavily on exports, and they have a close relationship with the U.S., so it makes sense that they'd prefer a diplomatic solution. But South Korea is facing immediate impact on key industries like their auto industry, so they're stepping in with government support to kind of soften the blow.
Makes sense. And we're seeing different approaches from other countries, too. Australia's emphasizing negotiation, Brazil might take action through the WTO, and Mexico's putting together a broader program, but they're avoiding those tit-for-tat tariffs. Why isn't there one unified global response?
Because international trade is complicated. Every country's reaction is shaped by its own unique relationship with the U.S., its domestic politics, and its overall approach to trade. It's really hard to get a bunch of countries to agree on a single response, especially when they have different interests and priorities.
So overall, it sounds like the information we have suggests there's a real risk of a full-blown trade war. And that could have some pretty negative effects on the global economy and on prices for consumers. Based on what we've seen so far, how could those negative consequences actually play out?
It's kind of a domino effect, right? If these tariffs keep going up, imports get more expensive, and that can lead to higher prices for consumers, which means they might buy less. Businesses might get hit, they might invest less, maybe even cut jobs, and all of that could slow down the global economy. And then there's the supply chain issue. Disruptions to those established supply chains, that can lead to inefficiencies, and that can also contribute to price increases. It's a complicated picture, but not a great one.
So what does all of this mean for the average person listening? This whole deep dive, it really paints a picture of a world where trade tensions are heating up pretty fast. The responses we've looked at, they show a range of strategies, some good, some maybe not so good. But one thing's clear, global supply chains are really interconnected. Certain resources are incredibly valuable, and different countries have different economic priorities, and it's all coming to a head now.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly interesting is that these diverse reactions, they suggest there's no easy answer to these trade disputes. Each country is really having to think carefully about its options, about what's going to happen in the short term and in the long term.
And it raises a pretty important question. In a world where a country decides to impose tariffs, on its own, and get such a mixed bag of responses, what does that mean for big international trade agreements? Is this just a bump in the road? Or are we seeing a fundamental change in the way global commerce works? It's something to think about.